Okay, I'm going to start. Thank you. My name is David Levine. I'm co-chair of Science Writers in New York. I want to thank my co-chair, Joseph Bonner, who is producing this show for us. If you have questions for our guest, Pam Fessler, please put them in the Q&A box, and I will ask the questions. Pam Fessler is a correspondent on NPR's national desk, where she covers poverty, philanthropy, and voting issues. In her reporting at NPR, Pam does stories on homelessness, hunger, affordable housing, and income inequality. She reports on what nonprofit groups, the government, and others are doing to reduce poverty and how these efforts are working. She won the 2011 First Place National Headliner Award. She also covers elections and voting, including efforts to make voting more accessible, accurate, and secure. She has done many stories on the debate over state voter ID laws, to Russian hacking attempts and long lines at the polls, something we haven't heard about in years.
No, it's not a very big story at all.
I just want to get your book. I put it over here.
I have it.
Okay, so you can tell. Well, we'll do a show and tell. So the book is Carvilles Cure, Leprosy, Stigma, and the Fight for Justice. As we know, leprosy has been around a very long time. It's first mentioned 600 BC in India, China, and Egypt. It's also mentioned very prominently in the Bible. According to this one site, 68 times in the Bible, 55 times in the Old Testament, and 13 times in the New Testament. Pam earlier asked me if I read the Bible to make sure of that, and I have not. I'm compared, but also it's a infectious bacterial agent. It's now known as Hansens disease. So I want to ask you, why don't you tell people why you wrote the book? If you have a personal connection.
Yeah, well, as the one thing you pointed out, the one thing I don't cover is science or medicine. I cover a lot of other topics. So this is completely outside of anything that I ever knew about. And the reason I wrote this book was because about 20 years ago, my father-in-law, who was an elderly man at the time, he was 78 years old, he just called us out of the clear blue. And he said, and I say us, my husband and I, and he said, I have something I have to tell you. When I was a teenager, the public health service, I went to school and I came home and my father was gone. And the public health service had come and they had taken him away. And they took him to some hospital down south. He didn't know anything about where it was. Even as a 78-year-old man, he didn't know. He did know that his father had leprosy. He never saw his father or spoke to him again. And his mother told him, don't you ever tell anybody that your father had leprosy, because the stigma and the shame of this disease, this is in the 1930s, was so great. The thought was that it would ruin the family. So he had held it inside for more than 60 years. And now as an older man, he had just decided that he couldn't hold this secret any longer. So that's why he called and he told us. And so we did some research and found that there was this hospital in Carville, Louisiana, where leprosy patients in the United States for decades were taken and confined, isolated, often against their will, and many people stayed there until they died. And it was just a heartbreaking story to see what had happened, that my father-in-law had lost his father, especially when we found out that this is a disease that is only mildly contagious. 95% of the human race can't even contract this disease, but because the stigma was so great and we had a lot of ignorance about the disease, we confined leprosy patients. That was the policy in the United States. And so when we went down there to visit, I learned that his story was hardly the only one, that there were hundreds, there were thousands of families that had been similarly torn apart, and where this burden of secrecy had really weighed people down and had ripple effects through generations. And that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted to reveal this pretty sad part of American history.
So in this book, you have some photographs. I'll show them. Old photographs, black and white. But I was very struck by there's one patient who was 7 years old, was admitted as a patient around 1929. He lived at Carville until his death at age 91.
Right, isn't that amazing?
That is amazing, kind of sad and amazing. So tell us about Carville. How did Carville come to be?
So it started out in the late 1800s, and it was first a state institution. It was what was called the Louisiana Leper Home. And around the turn of the century, you had, obviously, as probably most of your listeners know, there was the germ theory was, gaining traction. And people, not only doctors and scientists, but also the general public was increasingly aware that germs caused diseases. And this began in Louisiana, which had, terrible. They had yellow fever. They had, a malaria. They had lots of illnesses, and there was also leprosy at the time in New Orleans, and there was a belief not only that this germ might spread. And get lots of people very ill, but that also that immigrants, you also at the same time had all these immigrants that were coming into Louisiana, but also the United States in general. And there was a fear that these immigrants were bringing in these exotic diseases. So it was actually, a lot of it was started by the newspapers that, they said, we need to do something about it. We have people who have leprosy who are walking the streets of New Orleans. Let's do something about it. And there was a demand that the state should isolate these patients. And simultaneously, you had some doctors who thought actually isolating leprosy patients was a good thing, because it would ultimately, they believed incorrectly, that it would ultimately eliminate the disease if you took everybody who had it and isolated them. And so the state decided to have what they called the Louisiana Leper Home. Initially, it was supposed to be in New Orleans, because the doctors thought, oh, this is great. We can also, these patients can get good care. We can also do research and maybe ultimately find a cure. But when they tried to build the home, nobody wanted it anywhere nearby. All the neighbors, anytime they had a particular site, they said, that the neighbors came out and said, there's no way we don't want these people anywhere near us. And so ultimately they found a plantation, an abandoned plantation about 70 miles up the river, along the Mississippi River. And it was abandoned. And they snuck the patients who were in New Orleans up there in the middle of the night on a barge, because they didn't want the neighbors around this place to find out that patients were coming. And they even told them it was going to be an ostrich farm. They snuck the patients in the middle of the night, and that's how it got started.
And it was not very easy to get to. I mean,
No. They basically put these patients as far away and as remote an area as possible, basically just to get them away from civilization. And it was probably one of the worst places to treat people who had a disease. It was mosquito infested. They weren't near they had no access to healthcare. They could not get doctors to come to treat the patients. At Carville. They couldn't even get anybody to come and nurse them. They eventually had to recruit the Daughters of Charity sisters who worked at Charity Hospital in New Orleans to come out there to care for the patients, because nobody else would do it. And when we're talking about an abandoned plantation, I mean, this place was fallen down. There were rats, there were bats. The patients they put out in the old slave cabins in the back. There was nothing there. I mean, they really were left to fend for themselves.
And when did it open?
So it began, and this is as the state institution in 1894. The sisters didn't come until 1896. So for 2 years, the patients were pretty much on their own. And then about 20 years later, the US federal government took over Carville, and it was the same thing. There was this increasing sentiment around the country that there were patients, people who had leprosy, that immigrants were bringing it in. There was a lot of anti-Chinese immigrant sentiment. There was a belief that they were bringing this disease into the country and that we should, the nation had to do something. The nation had to create a leprosarium. Same thing, federal government tried to find a place to put it, that nobody wanted it anywhere. So they eventually decided to purchase the Louisiana Leper Home and take over it. And then it became a US Public Health Service hospital in 1921.
When I read the book, I thought, well, it was probably closed by 1940s, 1950s. No, it just recently.
The last patient who left, now we should tell, for years, for decades, patients were forced to go there. They were confined there against their will. I mean, some people were brought there in shackles. They were stuck in boxcars and locked boxcars and brought there. There was a big fence around there. There were guards. If you escaped and they caught you, they would put you in what was called the Carville Jail, which was basically a little jail inside this big leprosarium or compound. Eventually, people, when we did find a cure, which in fact was found at Carville in the 1940s, eventually patients were allowed to go home when they started getting cured. But people continued to come there who had this disease because it was one of the only places in the country where you could get treated. So what had been kind of a prison sort of became a haven for people who had leprosy. And some of the patients who had been there most of their lives, when it was okay for them to leave, they didn't want to leave because they had nowhere to go. I mean, the government had basically taken their lives away and their families away. And they said, I'm sorry, we're staying here. You got to take care of us for the rest of our lives. And the last patient, residential patient, left in 2015.
So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom. Don't put them in the chat box. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you about, so it was pretty well known that this was not a highly contagious disease.
No.
No, it's not true.
No.
Well, I know the CDC did say it was for a while.
So what happened is, it's kind of interesting because there was a division in the medical community. So even in the late 1800s, when there was this demand to create the Louisiana Leper Home, there were doctors who said, this is not that contagious. There are so many other things that we have to worry about, like TB, yellow fever, other issues like malaria, much more highly contagious diseases. But there were other doctors who actually did believe that it was quite contagious. So there was a division in the medical community. And that division continued, well, I would say into the 50s or 60s. But it was kind of interesting. I just think that the social pressure the stigma was so great with this disease that the pressure was on not only doctors, but politicians to treat it as though it were highly contagious. And I just want to read you one quick thing, because I think, especially your people who write about science. So there was this division, as I mentioned, and the Times-Picayune, the newspaper in New Orleans at the time, it was called the Daily Picayune, was leading the charge, basically, to set up this Louisiana Leper Home. And it was pretty mad that there was this division in the medical community about whether or not it was contagious. And so they actually printed this editorial that says, when doctors disagree so radically on matters of such great public importance, the only remedy is to appeal to common sense and reason and enact proper protection for the people's health. The newspaper had an easy solution. It said that the state should simply, quote, declare that leprosy was contagious so that the patients could be quarantined. So they just wanted the politicians, forget, the experts be damned. They just wanted the politicians to say, okay, this is contagious. We need to isolate these people.
Tuberculosis was known to be very contagious.
I'm sorry, what?
Tuberculosis was
Right. And the patients, and the patients at Carville, after a while, they all realized that it was not that contagious, because none of the workers over decades who worked at Carville, none of the doctors, none of the nurses ever contracted the disease. And they began to get, pretty disturbed and upset that people who had TB or much more contagious diseases, maybe they were away for a while, but they were never isolated for life. They were never torn away from their families. They never had their children taken away from them. They never had their identities taken away. At Carville, it was recommended that you take an alias when you became a patient there, because the shame was considered so great. You wouldn't want to embarrass your family. The patients there actually lost their right to vote until 1946, which is astonishing. I mean, they were truly treated as prisoners.
And they couldn't marry either.
No, they could not marry inside. Certainly they couldn't do it legitimately. There were lots of young people there, and of course, some of them, they fell in love, and some of them, what they would do is escape. They had this, as I say, there was this fence, and they had something called the hole in the fence, which was way over in some corner, and they would escape under the hole in the fence. They would go like into New Orleans or Baton Rouge. They would get married, and then they would come back. And they would come back because the world outside wasn't so nice sometimes to people who had been diagnosed with leprosy, and they actually felt better sometimes being inside Carville.
We also write about that. There was kind of a wink policy that later on that patients went to jazz clubs nearby.
Yes, yeah. And this was more in the, so after the federal government took over in the 1920s, they started, there was recognition by the Public Health Service, and specifically the doctors who were at Carville, that this was these patients' home. That it was their home. It was not a hospital. I mean, it was a hospital, but it was really their home. This is their life. And some of them were going to be there for potentially decades. And so they had a school, they had dances, they had Mardi Gras parades, they had sport athletic teams, they had bands, they had a patient newspaper called The Star, which we can talk about later because it was actually very instrumental in winning back the rights of patients. And they knew that some of the patients, especially like the young people, would escape. Sometimes they'd sneak out at night and they would go to local bars to have a good time or go to dances. And they would usually, as I say, come back because this was where they were cared for. So you're right, it was, and so the further along, the later we got in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was much more of a loosening, and as you say, kind of a wink, wink. The doctors realized that these patients needed some kind of hope and some kind of life if they were going to actually get better.
So leprosy has never been romanticized, but
exactly,
tuberculosis has been. I mean, Chopin had it, and he was coughing, and there was a PBS special, and George Joeguerrero was coughing, and I love you so much. Doc Holliday had it, and he said, "No, right. I'm not as sick as you think I am." And he was able to gamble and kill people, and there's a lot of famous people who had TB, and there are lots of famous books about it, like The Magic Mountain. And I live right across from a apartment complex that was built for TB patients.
Oh, really? Huh?
They all have terraces. It's right near the East River. So they thought water was a cure.
Right.
They thought putting people on top of mountains was a cure. It wasn't, but it was a nice fantasy.
Yeah, they didn't stick them in some swamp in Louisiana.
No, they actually were in nice places. And I guess part of the reason is that because lepers had even though it's not, it's really more of a neurological disease, but their parents, you know, they had all these, what is a leper? What happens? What's the sequelae of disease? They change appearances,
Well, there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, I think it was the appearance, but I just, you know, before I talk about the appearance and what happens with the disease, it's also was this whole stigma from the Bible and the sense that these people were sinners and they had done something wrong and they should be cast out of society. But generally, it is basically as a nerve, the germ affects and basically takes over the nervous system. So some of the initial symptoms are numbness in hands and feet, or people can also have numb areas of their skin. They can then start getting lesions and marks. Now, there is quite a variety or range of symptoms. So some people at Carville who had leprosy, you would not know at all. I mean, you would just look, they would seem perfectly normal, you know, and there was nothing that gave them away. But then you have on the other extreme, people who have very severe cases who would get lesions on their faces, you know, that kind of, you know, just like bumpy, you know, all over their face. The cartilage in their nose might start collapsing. People would become sometimes with clawed hands because it would affect the, you know, this, whatever this is. Remember, I'm not a science writer. You know, the nerves in their hands, so their hands would claw up. And then the other thing that would happen, because they didn't have feeling in their hands or feet, they would damage or injure themselves. And that's where you get this myth that people with leprosy lose their fingers and their feet, that, you know, that it starts, their fingers start falling off. Generally what it is they injure themselves. They might cut their fingers, they might burn their fingers, they might step on a nail, they might step on glass, and they will have no idea that they did that. And because then you know, after the damage is done, often people will have to get amputations. The other thing is that some of the bone gets reabsorbed back into the body, so some of the extremities will get shortened as well. So you're right. I mean, people who had a serious case of the disease were, quite frankly, repulsive to many people to look at. And the thought that, you know, oh my goodness, I'm going to get this, you know, it was enough for people to say, I just want these people away from me. Now, what we didn't know, or what lots of people didn't know at the time, was that it is an extraordinarily slow developing disease. So my father-in-law's father, the one I told you went to Carville in the 1930s, we believe he contracted it in 1902 in the Philippines when he was in the Spanish-American War. He did not feel his first symptoms until 1922. So it took 20 years for it to progress enough that he even had symptoms that made him go to the doctor. It's one of the slowest progressing diseases there is.
And it's also, doctors are not very good at diagnosing it all the time.
Right. Right. Well, especially in the United States, because they don't see it very much anymore, about 200 new cases a year. But it was always difficult because they would think that it does actually have some, you know, similarities to TB. There were other, you know, obviously other skin diseases. So it would often be misdiagnosed. So some people ended up at Carville who probably did not have leprosy. And then, of course, the people with leprosy who, you know, were never diagnosed, or they were diagnosed, and this still happens today, they were diagnosed too late, you know, after they had already started to suffer from these more serious and permanent disabilities. And that's what happens in a lot of countries around the world today.
One thing struck me, you're right, about 1980s, the AIDS epidemic started.
Right.
And there was actually talk of quarantining AIDS patients until Ryan White,
right,
hemophilia, and then it was very hard to justify doing that to victims who got it just not because of lifestyle or intravenous drug use or being gay, but because they happened to get a blood transplant.
Right.
And that kind of changed the tune a little bit. Also, you had a lot of celebrities that, you know, from Broadway and from Elizabeth Taylor to Broadway actors to all kinds of stuff who became advocates for these people.
You mean the AIDS patients?
The AIDS patients.
Right.
There were some advocates I was very surprised to read for lepers. One of them was Tallulah Bankhead and Marlon Brando.
Right. First of all, I just say I don't use the word leper. And one of the reasons I don't is, and that I will tell you why. So the patients, as I started to get a little bit around the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they started becoming advocates they started realizing that they were being mistreated and unfairly treated, that they should not be confined. And there was this patient who came, his name was Stanley Stein. He was a young man who came there, and he was very ambitious and also was a writer and an actor and just was very involved, and he wanted to change Carville. So what he did was he asked the powers that be, the public health service, do you mind if we have a patient newspaper? And they're like, sure, that's no problem. And it started out initially as just a mimeograph 4-page sheet that talked about the menu for Sunday night's dinner and what movies were showing and, you know, who was visiting who. But eventually the patients started writing articles that started questioning what the government was doing to them. Why are we here? And they started doing a lot of research into this disease and what kind of research was going on around the world to try and find a cure for leprosy. And this newspaper, which was called The Star, became a leading publication around the country for leprosy patients and in the public health arena. And part of it was because Stanley Stein was very good at attracting people, outsiders who could help the patient cause. First one that they did was the American Legion. The American Legion, there were a number of patients who were veterans, like my husband's grandfather, who had picked up the disease while fighting an American war. And so there was a sense of the American Legion, well, we should do something for these poor patients who fought for the United States, contracted this disease, and now are basically imprisoned. So the American Legion adopted the Star. And they started circulating it all around the country. It got a circulation eventually of 80,000, believe it or not. And the other thing is it started attracting attention from the public, what was going on at Carville. And Stanley Stein, who I said was interested in the theater, had a mutual friend with Tallulah Bankhead, who at the time was a big Broadway actress and movie actress at the time. And one day he was at Carville and he was told there was a phone call for him at the front office. He went there and he picked up the phone and she said, "It's Tallulah, darling." I can't quite do it, and he of course almost keeled over because she was a huge actress at the time. Well, they developed an amazing friendship. And she said, "I'm going to do what I can to help you and to help the cause." And she actually sold subscriptions of the Star to all her Broadway friends, all her Hollywood friends. When I was doing research for the book, I could find these letters, "Dear Jimmy Durante," this is from Stanley Stein, "Tallulah says you want to subscribe to my newspaper. It's $5 for a year. And could you please spread the word about what the patients are going through?" And there were just tons of letters like this. And one of the letters I found was a letter from a young Marlon Brando who had just opened on a show on Broadway called A Streetcar Named Desire. He was 26 years old. And I found this handwritten letter in the archives down at Carville. And he said, "Dear Stanley, my friends tell me that your patients are not being treated very fairly. I really want to do something. Let me know what I can do to help." So it's really kind of we have it's a 2-part story. It's this terrible tragic thing that happened to these patients, but then these patients fought back. And I think it's an extraordinary story about human resilience and fighting for justice, quite frankly.
Well, there's one patient, John Early.
Yeah.
It was very interesting that he went to Broadway shows. He mingled among the rich because he knew that was a way to, he knew that was a way for acceptance. And he also, so there are parallels I see between COVID-19 and Hansens disease, is that the poor are treated very differently from the rich. And rich lepers didn't often always end up in institutions.
Well, actually,
Some did.
yeah, it's not, that's to me, that's kind of the interesting. Oh, and back to the word the leper, what I was going to say is one of the things that Stanley Stein led a crusade for was to try and get rid of the word leper and leprosy just because of the stigma and have it called Hansen's disease and people with Hansen's disease. But I think that was actually the interesting thing about Carville. It wasn't just poor people. It was rich people. It was poor people. It was highly educated people. There were people, who had PhDs from Harvard who were patients there. There were people who were illiterate. There were farm workers. There was a Talmudic scholar. There were people of all races in this world. It was really a world unto itself. There were, Black patients, white patients, Hispanic patients, Asian patients. And this is in we're talking the Jim Crow South in the 1920s, 1930s. It was a sort of an extraordinarily diverse world. And I think it was actually that diversity that helped the patients band together and decide that, yes, we should fight for our rights. We are not being treated fairly. I think, quite frankly, if it had just been poor people there, I don't know, they might still be there, who knows? But it was the fact that you had this very wide cross section of America that they were bound together by the discrimination they felt from the outside world. And they really worked together to fight for their rights against what was ultimately bad public health policy.
It was terrible public health policy. So here's a question. How many patients went there and how many at a time would be there?
So it's about 5,000 over the life of Carville. And that was from the late 1800s to, around 2000. At a given time, I would say between 350 and 500 at a given time. And later on, obviously the patients would come and go, but that was it. And they had dorms. When the federal government took over, they by then the Plantation house had been rebuilt and was actually the administration building, but they had also built dorms. They had built an infirmary. They had beautiful, if you go there now, you can go there now, it's a National Historic Site. Long screened in corridors that connected all the buildings because a lot of the patients were in wheelchairs because of the problems with their feet. And this way they could go from building to building and never actually have to go outside. So it's actually quite a facility now. It's quite an elaborate facility.
Another question, did you use the book Miracle at Carville for your research?
I did, yes.
In your opinion, did it paint an overly rosy picture of the place?
It's interesting because I don't think that it painted an overly rosy picture at all. So this is a book, it's called Miracle at Carville, and it was written around 1950 by one of the patients. Her name was Betty Martin. She was a 19-year-old debutante from New Orleans when she was diagnosed with the disease. And she was taken there when she was about, I think it was about 1928. And she was a perfect case of somebody who showed absolutely no sign of having leprosy. She was a beautiful young woman. She just had like a little red spot on her hand, but it had been diagnosed as leprosy. So she was brought there. She ended up spending, gosh, really ultimately most of her life there, but she met a young man. They fell in love, and they are an example of a couple who escaped after they were there for about, I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly, about 10 years. They decided to escape. They got married. They went to New Orleans. They got married. They tried to live on the outside, but he kept getting sicker. So they eventually moved back. Once they stayed there for another decade or so, eventually when the medication started being used, the treatment in the 40s and 50s that started to cure the disease, they both tested negative and they left. And she wrote this book called Miracle at Carville. And the miracle was this medication that they had tried everything. They tried everything on these patients, a willow bark, chalmugra oil, heat things, and nothing worked. And one of the doctors, who was the chief medical officer in 1941, his specialty was tuberculosis. And at the time, there was an experimental drug called Promin, a sulfa drug, that had been tried on TB patients, but not with any success. But because there were similarities between TB and Hansen's disease, he said, well, maybe we should try it on the Hansen's disease patients and see what happens. Well, they tried it, and they had basically a trial, and these patients, as far as I can tell, volunteered to do this, including Betty Martin's husband. And lo and behold, after about 6 months, people started getting better. Those bumps and lesions on their faces started to disappear. All other symptoms started to disappear. Didn't work for everyone. People with really serious cases, it didn't work very well, but it was the beginning. And that was the name of Betty's book, Miracle at Carville. And that was the miracle. And when they left, she wrote this book. And it actually became a bestseller at the time, which was when people around the country for the first time started learning that this institution existed. But the interesting thing is the author of that book was named Betty Martin. As I say, that was her alias. When she lived outside, her real name was Edwina Para. When they were outside, she used Edwina Para, her real name, and never wanted anybody to know that she and her husband had ever had leprosy or been patients there. So when this book came out and was a bestseller, she could not acknowledge that she was the author of that book. Because the shame was so great. She was so worried about the stigma.
I mean, there was a woman there you wrote about who won the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Right.
Being a spy for the U.S. government. Can you tell her story?
So her name was Joeguerrero, and she was a Filipina. And during World War II, she had contracted leprosy. And the Japanese who were occupying the Philippines at the time really were repulsed by leprosy. And so when they saw her walking around, they would just stay really far away. They would kind of ignore her, or just stay as far away as possible. So she used this to her advantage, and she became a spy for the Allies. And what she would do is go around Manila and check out where the Japanese had all of their weapons, where they were protecting the city, where their forces were. And she would then get messages out to the US troops. And they believe that she probably saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives when the US finally invaded the Philippines. When after the war, she was then confined to a a leprosarium in the Philippines, but it was really not very good conditions at all. And some of the patients at Carville, who, as I say, had become kind of international advocates and activists, started lobbying the US government to allow her to come and stay at Carville, because it really was only for US citizens. They were finally able to get her into the United States. She won the Congressional Medal, and she ultimately came to Carville and lived there for a while and got cured and went off and led the rest of her life. But that was another way that, you know, Stanley Stein, as I keep going back to him, he knew how to use these high profile cases to get attention for their cause. And their cause being, we should not be treated like inmates. We need to be treated like patients. We need to be treated like people who have a disease that needs to be treated.
So there are parallels with the lockdowns that we all experienced, isolation, of people getting depressed. Because many of the stories I read, that people became very depressed there.
Oh, yes, yes. And it's interesting, though, they didn't become, I mean, partly they were depressed by being there, obviously, and being isolated. I think they were more depressed because they realized what their fate was. Right. Their fate that, you know, they were going to be pariahs. And many people, even today, who are diagnosed with leprosy, contemplate suicide. And when we went back and looked at my my husband's grandfather's records, he told the doctors at Carville, we had the report, when he first heard that he had leprosy, that's the first thing he thought about doing, was killing himself. And that's very common. That's very common.
Yes, but I mean, there was that you know, a lot of patients just kind of just withdrew. They couldn't really do much.
Right.
And as you said, the living conditions were not so great. Some of the presidents got involved a little bit. I mean, you mentioned Lyndon Johnson at some point, and some others. Who they try to bring attention to it, and the congressional response was not that great all the time.
No, I think, you know, really, for the most part, people who were sent to Carville were forgotten. I mean, they were essentially abandoned, not only by, you know, their families and communities, but by the country. You know, for the most part. I mean, there were so many, you know, so many other diseases. You know, when we had obviously the flu, you know, in 1918, we had, you know, World War I, we had, you know, all these other, polio, we had all these other things that really affected so many more Americans. And that's where the focus of medical research was. That's where the focus of public policy was. And quite frankly, you know, nobody really cared about these 300 to 500 people down in Louisiana. But it was interesting. They did finally get their right to vote back in 1946. And that was because one of the high profile patients, it wasn't this Joeguerrero, it was another World War II veteran, a man who had survived the Bataan Death March. His wife was brought there. And in 1946, he's like, whoa, we just survived the war being prisoners by the Japanese, and now we're confined by our own government and we lose the right to vote. And the absurdity of that just struck everybody. And within like days, the Louisiana legislature passed a law saying they could vote. My point is that once they did get the right to vote, the patients actually became a fairly influential voting bloc in that area. It was a pretty remote area of the state. And that's when they started having more influence with members of Congress, their local politicians. And they used those members of Congress to try and, you know, get more money for Carville, more money for research, and ultimately their freedom.
What laws allowed people to be taken in the middle of the night and just disappearing? Were they federal laws, state laws? And it did vary from state to state also. Well,
yes. I mean, so what it is, in 1917, Congress because of this guy, John Early, who made a big stink. You have to read the book about him. He's amazing. Congress in 1917 passed this law creating the National Leprosarium. And what it did, it gave the public health authorities in each state the power to decide whether somebody who was diagnosed with leprosy should be sent to the National Leprosarium. So it was up to the public health officials in each state. Every state except New York sent their patients right to Carville. And the reason New York didn't, and here we go back to this lack of knowledge about a disease, doctors in New York said, you know what? This is not that contagious a disease. We are not sending our patients to Carville. This is not, they do not need to be isolated. But everybody else in the country said they should. And so what happened is my husband's grandfather, he was diagnosed in Connecticut with the disease in 1922. And the doctor told him, I'm going to have to report you to the public health authority, and they're going to take you and confine you at Carville for the rest of your life. And he had 3 young children and a business at the time. The doctor said, but if you go to New York, you can live free and not be confined. And he packed up his things that night and fled to New York and built a new business for himself, and then had his family come. He was eventually taken away because he got so sick, and but he lived in New York for about 13 years. Before he was eventually taken away. But isn't that interesting? I mean, one side of the border, you're a threat to the nation's public health. The other side of the border, you're fine.
That is. Someone asked, will you write a sequel about the colony on the island of Molokai?
Molokai.
Okay. That's in Hawaii, I believe?
It is Hawaii. Yeah, and actually there's a very good book called The Colony that has already been written about Molokai. And it was that was a leprosy colony that was started by the Hawaiian government at the time in the mid 1800s. And a lot of similar themes. These people were taken away from their families, they were isolated and basically abandoned by society because they had this disease that everybody, unnecessarily feared.
So what is the treatment today for Hansens disease?
So it is what they have is they call it, it's like a 3-drug cocktail treatment, and it's basically antibiotics. One of which is the sort of the descendant of that initial one that they tried back in 1941 at Carville, where the patient's skin started clearing up. My understanding is that when you are given this treatment, within about 48 to 72 hours, you are no longer contagious. It could take maybe up to a year to get all presence of the bacteria out of your body. But within 3 days, you're just not contagious at all, even though, as I say, this is not a very contagious disease. But the problem is there's still 200,000 new cases diagnosed every year in the world, mostly in India and Brazil. But because of the stigma, people don't seek the treatment. So you have people who again, are cast out from society. They have to live in these, colonies, and they don't get treatment, even though it's readily available. WHO and Novartis have made this drug free to anybody in the world who needs it. But because of all the myths and ignorance and stigma, just many hundreds of thousands of people just are not treated.
So your book is coming out during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And, do you see parallels between what's going on in our government, different views of what's going on? Some people believe, some people have strange beliefs about COVID-19.
Right. right. Yeah, and I think that that's, to me, that's, well, there's two parallels. One was, that sort of weaponization of disease against immigrants back in the 1800s. They used it as a weapon against basically Chinese immigrants. They had Oriental leprosy, even though most of the patients were native-born Americans, but they really used it to demonize Asian immigrants. And then we have, now we have people, talking about Kung flu or the China virus, and it's still in some ways is being weaponized for other reasons, not necessarily related to the disease itself. The other parallel to me is just because we don't know a lot of things, this lack of information and ignorance in some ways just opens the way for misinformation, and it opens the way for people to basically then kind of do what their sort of prejudices tell them to do. So with leprosy, you had it, okay, we think these people are evil, we need to shut them away out of society, even though that was the wrong thing to do. And now we have people who say, oh, I don't need to wear a mask. Why are they trying to take away my freedom? And then you have this incredible conflict, and it's because we have, this sort of a lack of leadership plus a lack of good, solid information or knowledge even about exactly how the disease is spread, how pervasive it is, what's the best treatment. And so those are the parallels I see, which of course, ironically, COVID-19 is much more contagious and dangerous than leprosy ever was. But with leprosy, people got, quarantined for life. Whereas, we all know what's going on with COVID-19.
So we have time for a few more questions. Please put them in the box, and I can continue until they come. How many years did it take you to research this book? And how hard was it to get information?
It was not that hard at all, believe it or not. As I say, there's a museum down in Carville now. Actually, the whole facility is run by the Louisiana National Guard, uses it. I mean, it's a big open 350-acre site. But there is a museum there, and there are tons and tons of artifacts. That's where I found the Marlon Brando letter, and the Jimmy Durante and the Tallulah Bankhead stuff. Because there was this newspaper, The Star. It was a monthly newspaper. The patients wrote everything about their lives, their daily lives there. There are just tons of information there, letters. The Daughters of Charity, the nuns who work there, they were there until 2005. So they were there from 1896 to 2005, and they kept meticulous records. And their archives are actually right here outside of Washington, D.C. in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And I went up there and wow, I could find every letter that Sister Benedicta wrote, back in 1896, complaining how they didn't have any water. So I had tons of information. Plus then there were these memoirs. Stanley Stein wrote one, John Early typed out an informal memoir. Betty Martin wrote one. I almost had an overabundance of information. It was great. And then, of course, I interviewed patients. I interviewed people who had lived there. When I started doing the book, and it took me about 3 years, I would say, to do the whole thing. When I started around 2016 or 2017, there were still a dozen patients, elderly patients, who were being cared for in a Baton Rouge nursing home by the federal government, because they basically were, they had nowhere else to go. And so I was able to interview those patients. And most of them, they had lived there for decades. They had been at Carville for decades. So that was really, and there's only one of them left now. So I was very lucky that I was able to talk to these people before they passed away.
So usually our artists go on book tours. When I interview artists and writers, it's usually in person, and we sell books. So we're not selling books. So where can people get your book?
You can go, I mean, obviously, Amazon, you can go, indie books, a lot of independent bookstores, IndieBound, you can get, basically, I think, identify which independent bookstore you want to buy it through. At least around here in Washington, all the independent bookstores have it. It's easily accessible. You can get not only, paper copy, you can get a Kindle copy, you can get an audio copy. And I mean, people have told me they think at first you're like, oh, do I really want to read a book about leprosy? But I see it more as a book about people and people sort of up against the government and public health policy and I tried to tell it through their lives. And I did that because of my father-in-law, because I saw how much it had affected his life to have his father taken away. And I wanted to tell the stories of these other patients and what it meant, what the ripple effects. And you asked me, what are some of the parallels with today? I think that's the other thing. It just made me realize how all these decisions that the government makes just have so many repercussions on families. And we're not always sensitive to that. And I think that that's something we need to think about a lot more.
I want to recommend this book. It's really very readable. It's got great stories. You tell it very simply and with great power and great grace. So I do recommend you buy it. And I have one final question. Based on the research you did at Carville, do you have advice for people today who would like to document their experience with COVID-19 for posterity?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. And I hadn't even really thought about that. I mean, I just find that people who wrote about their experiences with leprosy, just was so powerful to have that today for me, that I think that if people write down their experiences and tell their stories, I mean, that is quite frankly, I mean, I don't do it at NPR because I cover other things, but I think that's what, not only NPR, but lots of news organizations are trying to do is chronicle these lives and what it means, not only the patients, but the caregivers, the doctors, the search for a vaccine. There's so many people, and as much as we can chronicle that, I think that there will be lessons that people, hopefully 10, 20, 30 years from now, it will prove very valuable for them.
Well, Anne Frank wrote her diary because the king said to people, record your experiences. We think it's important that maybe someone will read them.
Right.
In her case, many people did. So I really want to first thank you for being here tonight. I really enjoyed reading your book. There's some fascinating characters. There's humor in the book. I mean, there's a lot of sadness in the book. There's also some of these characters are just unbelievable characters, like Mr. Early. And I think everyone should read it, and you'll learn a lot. And so you can actually visit it.
Oh yeah, you can go to visit the museum. You can't right now because of, guess what, the pandemic, because this is a federal facility, the museum. But hopefully within, few months, it will be reopened. And I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful area. I mean, it was remote then, but now it's just this gorgeous open plantation. I mean, it really, with big live oak trees. It's really, I think it's definitely worth visiting.
Hopefully it's a little bit easier to get to than the first characters who had to get there.
Yeah, it's still, I mean, they have just paved the road, actually.
So do you have time for one or two more questions?
Sure, I'm fine, yeah.
Let's see. How'd you find the families of the patients?
Well, some of it was through these memoirs. And so I didn't find too many families of patients. I found the patients themselves. I did find, I have since, actually, it's kind of interesting, since I wrote the book, people are starting to come out of the woodwork. It's pretty interesting. I've been getting, because I have a website, PamFessler.com, and people who have heard about the book, I've been getting emails say, oh, my grandmother was there, and we never talked about it. Very, very similar stories, or people who are just curious. I found a man who actually was a patient there when he was a 10-year-old boy, and he's in his 70s now. And, he's only now really kind of talking about the experience there. So that's actually the great thing about having this, book come out now. I'm just really hearing a lot more. In fact, I probably will write an article about all of the stories that have emerged since I wrote the book as a result.
So again, I want to thank you. I want to thank Joe Bonner. We've been doing this all summer. We're taking a little break after Labor Day. We've last week we did 2 interviews in a row. I think we did about 15 or 20 altogether.
Wow.
Different aspects, and it's always a pleasure and nice to meet you in
Kind of, yeah.
virtual reality, because we spoke before. And again, thank you for all the audience who tuned in, and
Well, thank you very much.
and hope to meet you in person one day.
Yeah, no, it was a real pleasure, and I hope everybody writes stories about these kinds of issues, because I think they're really important.
And as a national correspondent in politics, I guess you're going to be watching the convention tonight?
Probably, yeah. And I cover mostly voting, so my brain is kind of, between the post office and, the next 2 months are going to be insane. So
that's one charitable way of putting it. Okay, thank you so much, and good evening, and everyone please stay safe.
thank you. It was a pleasure.